Welcome to the Campaign Trend Podcast, where you're joining in on a conversation with the entrepreneurs, operatives, and experts who make professional politics happen. I'm your host, Eric Wilson. Our guest today is David Kanevsky, president of 3D Strategic Research and the pollster for the Center for Campaign Innovation. In this episode, we dig into our 2025 post-election survey from Virginia and New Jersey to understand what it means for the 2026 midterms. All right, Dave, the big question for the 2026 midterms is, does Trump's coalition show up for Republicans running for Senate and House? And so this survey gave us some insights about who the midterm electorate might be. Tell us who showed up.
Yeah, so we did a survey first of all registered voters. And right now, mostly what I'm going to talk about is just those who are self-reported voters. We're waiting for voter file data to come back to look at who are non-voters, because that'll also give us a sense of, who are
didn't
Trump
show
voters
up.
who don't
Yeah.
show up. But we do have the voter file back. It just came back right after New Year in New Jersey. So we do know a little bit about who turned out in New Jersey. And the other great thing about New Jersey is they register by party. So when you look back at the 2024 electorate in New Jersey, Democrats had a 12-point edge on party registration. But what's really interesting is Trump only lost the state by 6 points. So there's no exit polls from the 24 election. But roughly speaking, if an electorate is 12 points more Democratic by registration and Trump's wins or loses by 6, that generally means he either won the registered unaffiliated voters and or he got some combination of more crossover among registered Dems and losses among Republicans. This year, again, the voter file that came back in New Jersey, the electorate was minus 13. So not a huge shift overall in terms of the net registration, very similar to 2012. It was about 6 points worse than it was for Republicans in 2021. And Chitterelli loses by 14 points. So he's losing, his margins of losses are very similar to what registration is. But what we see here among our survey of people who voted, the registered unaffiliated who voted this year said they supported Harris, which tells us the operating theory isn't that Republicans didn't turn out. In fact, there's about 100,000 more Republicans, registered Republicans who turned out in 2025 than in 2021. So Republican turnout increased, but what happened was about 400,000 more registered Democrats turned out in 2025 than in 2021. And that's actually the opposite of what happened if you look between 2017 and 2021. Republican turnout shot up a lot, and Democrat turnout shot up a little bit. So what, again, our data right now showing it isn't a failure of Republican turnout, it's independents who lean Republican seem to have not shown up. And the big thing we see, and this is not just true this year in Virginia and New Jersey, but also if you look at all midterm elections going back, 20 some years, college educated voters turn out at higher rates. Basically, if you are a postgraduate voter, you turn out at the same rate as a midterm that somebody with a high school degree turns out in a presidential year. And this is data that comes from the census current population survey that's, we have 20 years of data kind of showing this trend. So I think that's going to be a big challenge for Republicans. And again, it's less about the Trump coalition. It's more about, since Republicans have shifted more to being non-college voters, particularly non-college white voters, those are voters that are just much less likely to show up in midterm elections. In fact, that was a big challenge for the Obama coalition when they were very reliant on kind of more blue-collar voters. And now that those blue-collar voters have shifted and become more Republican, now that's a challenge for Republicans.
So it seems like there's a little bit of people like Trump and show up for Trump, but that doesn't carry over necessarily to people down the ballot running for governor, Senate, House. And so this kind of realignment of the coalition changes things. I mean, I think when you and I were getting started in politics, midterms were great for us because, that meant lower turnout and Republicans had a better chance. You fast forward 20 years and that's flipped.
Yeah, my only caution there would be, I don't think people should mistake this as they only show up for Trump when he's on the ballot, because that would be like saying, well, they only show up for Obama when he's on the ballot. And there's a great New York Times article. The head of the DCCC in 2013 was saying, you know what, we are going to replicate the Obama coalition in the midterms in 2014. And if you look at the 2014 results, like that didn't work for them. This isn't about the relationship between the voter and the presidential candidate. It's really the relationship between
The
the voter and
election.
their own,
Yeah.
socioeconomic, educational attainment that just makes it much, much harder to turn these folks out. Look, if you're a voter who shows up at a Trump rally, you're very, very likely to show up at a midterm. It's more the voters who kind of voted for Trump might not necessarily like him, but they're kind of blue collar disengaged voters that he was the better choice, that they thought that I think is going to be the challenge to show up, because again that's why the Republican leaning unaffiliateds didn't show up rather than actual Republicans who didn't show up in New Jersey.
So one of the things that our poll is unique in tracking is we monitor how voters consume media, specifically between broadcast and cable TV versus streaming. We saw that crossing happen a little sooner than we expected, and now we found that streaming is the dominant method for getting TV content. Break that down for us and help us understand what that means from a campaign perspective.
Sure. So if we go back to 2024 in our national survey, we see 44% of people say they only watch live TV via linear mode. So that's cable, antenna, satellite. 39% say they watch streaming only, whether that's a streaming TV or they don't watch live TV, but they stream on like Netflix or Amazon. You get about like 1 in 10% who say, well, I'll sometimes watch live TV linear. And we don't use the term linear, but that's how, well, we don't use the term linear when we ask you the question, but that's how advertisers think of them, linear versus streaming. So 1 in 10 are on both. And about 1 in 6 say they don't watch any live TV. So that means they only stream like a Netflix or, an Apple TV, whatever, Crunchyroll, for example. And some of our statewide data looks very similar. And one of the biggest predictors is whether you watch streaming or linear is what's your age. Not surprisingly, like younger voters are much more likely to be reachable on streaming than older voters who may not have cut the cord yet. And so when we talked about this, it was like, okay, eventually those lines are going to cross, but would have expected that to happen in 2028 rather than like 2025 or 2026. Because again, if age is such a strong predictor,
Older people
midterm
turn
off year
out in
electorates.
midterms. Yeah.
Yeah, who shows up there? It's older electorates. And this year in both states, we see that more people were watching live TV via streaming rather than linear. Um, Virginia, especially so, because cable is much lower there. So you don't, particularly in rural areas. And then the other part is also not just, are you watching streaming, but can we reach you with advertising? And what we find is about 1 in 5 voters in New Jersey don't watch any live TV, which means they only stream content, or they say they don't watch any TV. They're just scrolling on TikTok, for example. And then in Virginia, that was actually a little bit higher. It was about 3 in 10 who say they watch no live TV. So it's really that kind of shift that has happened, sooner than I think we would have expected, just based on what we see in Virginia and New Jersey.
And that's a problem, of course, for campaigns where typically our biggest line item of expense is on broadcast TV advertising.
Yeah.
Still very expensive, but fewer and fewer people are consuming it over the airwaves or through cable, and may get it through some of their streaming, may not. And so it's really made this situation a lot more complex for campaigns.
Do find still, even though there is more streaming, more voters are reachable via streaming advertising than actually linear advertising. And there's, the bulk of people are reachable via both. But again, even if you're streaming on, Netflix or some of these other platforms, only about 1 in 4 voters overall watch a streaming platform with that is ad free. Most people are still watching some kind of ad supported streaming platforms. Um, but even if you account for that and the platforms that don't let you advertise, again, like the Netflix and the Apple TVs of the world, we still get a majority of people we can sell an ad to and put it in front of their eyeballs on a streaming platform, which is, again, higher than uh, what linear only gets you.
And for folks who are following along, we will link to some charts. This data is a little bit easier to follow when you have the charts in front of you, so be sure and check out the show notes for that. Um, the number of voters, this is something that kind of jumped out last election to me. The number of voters who are news avoiders, where they say, I intentionally avoid news, or I only bump into it. I don't have a habit of finding it. Seem to hold, steady relative to 2024, and that might be a little bit counterintuitive because you think of a more engaged electorate, they're going to be more news watchers, but that's not exactly what happened. What is driving this sort of news avoider voter? And again, dive into what this means for campaigns, and how do we get at them?
Sure. Well, in 2024, nationally, about 50% of people said they actively follow the news. There's about 25% who are what we call somewhat active, which is they say they're passive, but when there's a big story, they'll tune in. And then a quarter of people say, oh, I generally passively watch it, or I avoid the news, which is relatively small, about just under 1 in 10. This year in Virginia and New Jersey, the numbers were actually very similar across both states. That passive news avoiders, not much change, going from 1 in 4 to about 1 in 5. The active news consumers did go up a little bit, which makes sense for an off year election. They go up from 50% to about 6 in 10. Um, but I think what's happening here is the way we think of it's not news as news, um, and more news as a bundle. When we think about when people turn to news, local news, your broadcast news outlets, it wasn't necessarily what we're finding out now is they were going there for news. They were going there for traffic, weather, and sports. And now all of a sudden, all three of those things you can find on apps on your phone. So that's part of why we've seen a big decrease in um, local news consumption nationally. You don't need to go to the local TV or your local newspaper to get all of those things. You can kind of find them all separately. Um, it also means, people are on more platforms. So in Virginia and Jersey, what we found was there are now more voters who are on TikTok and LinkedIn than on X slash Twitter, however you want to call it. So again, it's kind of this fragmentation across all these platforms. And what's really important when you think about these people who pay the least amount of attention, back when I used to manage campaigns, we would put all of our advertising around, local news adjacencies, because the theory was the people who watch the local news are more likely to vote, and they are. But what we're also seeing is the people who are most likely to watch the local news are the least persuadable people because their opinions are so well formed because they're kind of following all this information on news, online, on all these multiple sources. And the people who are most likely to swing between parties and most likely within an election to split their ticket are the people who pay the least amount of attention to the news. Because if they paid a lot of attention that had very strongly held, well formed opinions, um, so we really need to find people where they are. Because again, this kind of news has really been unbundled. So campaigns are really going to need to figure out how do you reach disengaged voters who aren't paying attention, you know, uh, to news, to cable news in particular, kind of the traditional news sources.
Yeah, you've brought up a memory for me growing up, which is we couldn't leave the house until after the 6 o'clock news's weather report came on. And so that meant we had to watch about 15 minutes of news, probably 5 minutes of ads, and then the weather would come, and then it was safe to now leave home. Now, you just open it on your app while you're going to wherever you're going. And that total unbundling has happened.
And yeah, when you would be doing that, what would happen there is one, you would see some campaign ads. And two, there would probably be a local news story about like what's happening in, the Senate race, congressional race, something about politics, which is now these voters who no longer are getting their news from news means they're no longer getting those kind of content. And so now campaigns have to go figure out, okay, how do I reach these kind of unbundled voters?
Yeah, and so Dave, after I had a chance to step back and dig into all of this data, the big takeaway for me is that campaigns are dealing with two distinct electorates, and it reminds me of the old Law and Order intro in the criminal justice system. The people are represented by two separate yet equally important groups, and that's really kind of what the electorate looks like today. give us kind of a thumbnail sketch of who those two groups are. What do they look like? How are they different?
Sure. So there's kind of two groups. One is what I'd call highly engaged partisans. And those are highly engaged partisans on both sides. They generally tend to be pretty fixed in their views. They're more likely to be on linear. And then as a result, more likely to watch the news. Um, ad sync really, advertising syncs in really quickly for them since they're watching a lot of news. Um, they do tend to be a little bit more dem leaning in this environment just because. All of these things kind of engagement wise skew a little bit more democratic. But then really it's about reaching the other segment is kind of the politically disengaged. Um, that would be the others that don't follow the news as much, much younger, much more likely to be on streaming, but also much more likely to be persuadable.
Yeah. And they're still voting. I think that's the
Yeah,
important thing that people miss is like we've got these people who are really well engaged, and they follow the campaign. And I was thinking about, some of the focus groups we did last cycle where people would be able to name like, here's who's the executive director of this super PAC, and I can't believe that they did that to this candidate in a state that I've never lived in. And they're so engaged that they're following the nuts and bolts. And then there are other people who, they still vote, but they probably couldn't even tell you, who the candidates were until they showed up to vote.
no, totally, and especially when we think about political donors, like there's others who've kind of talked about them as political hobbyists. I describe them. It's what are the two strongest predictors of being a donor? One, it's older people, but then two, more college educated, and so these hobbyists are basically older people whose hobby is politics rather than pickleball.
Yeah,
And so they're following all of this stuff, and they know, not only what's happening in their state, but other states. And that's why you see, on both sides, money coming in, not just, from donors in your own state, but donors elsewhere who know, okay, these are the seats that are going to make the difference for, who wins and loses,
you're
the majorities.
You're listening to the Campaign Trend Podcast. I'm speaking with David Kanevsky about the findings from the Center for Campaign Innovation's 2025 post-election surveys from Virginia and New Jersey. Let's zoom in on those engaged partisans, who kind of live and breathe politics. That's their hobby. That's their entertainment. Who are they? What are they watching? What are they reading? Um, you said they lean more Democrat.
I mean, they watch everything. Like they over index on everything, whether it's, podcasts, whether it's uh traditional news, local news, everything. And in fact, remember when we first started asking about podcasts in our 2020 post election, like nationally, I think it was only like 3% of voters who on a daily basis listen to podcasts, maybe like 10% of donors. So those people are like the front edge of folks. And part of it is the reason why they're over indexing on everything is they're older voters. So they're retired and they have more time. And so they can bounce around from, whether it's watching, Fox News if you're a Republican donor or MSNBC if you're a Democratic donor, but you're also, on social media and listen to podcasts, all of those things. So they just over-index on almost every kind of political behavior you get, because again, that's their hobby. Um,
And I think what the key things that I think campaigns need to take away from this are we are really good at running campaigns to those people. There are 404s on the voter file. They vote in every election, so they get every piece of mail we send. They're in all of our files. Their doors get knocked, those kinds of things. But as you pointed out earlier, they're also the most firm in their opinions, least likely, their behavior is pretty fixed, their ideology is pretty fixed. And so, we run a TV ad, they see it really quickly, it sinks in. But then we've got these disengaged. I call them the cord nevers, and not 100% accurate of how to describe them, but it gives a good kind of mental image of these people just aren't cutting. They're so young that they never cut the cord. They
yeah.
just never had one. And so these are people who are not watching the news on cable. They don't really follow politics. They're streaming without ads. How are campaigns supposed to get in front of these people?
You just have to be active on a lot of platforms and in a lot of vehicles. And so they may not watch, traditional linear television, traditional linear uh, cable, but there may be some content. If you are on Fox News and you want to reach kind of the kind of low propensity, kind of core never right leaning voter, well, now you need to take that Fox News clip and put it on social media, put it on TikTok, places like that. But the other part I would say is especially, start with reposting content, but also how can you figure out how your message matches the medium in which people are consuming news and information, especially um, again, not just the younger partisans, but particularly these kind of core nevers, disengaged folks. If you think about with the rise of vertical video, people watching on their phones, okay, how can I get them in the first 6 seconds so they're not, scrolling by? Like, what's going to make them want to watch your content that is more politically engaged instead of some cute animal video, for example? Um, it also means campaigns need to be doing more paid advertising on streaming, and not just. It also means more streaming platforms. The average voter watches four, different streaming platforms, so it's not just okay streaming on sports, but hey, uh, are we buying Tubi? Are we buying Crunchyroll? Are we buying all these different things because they're hopping around different platforms? Another part is especially disengaged voters. Again, are actually the most persuadable. Trump did really well with them, but these aren't Republicans. They're persuadable. Um, in fact, I would almost think the less likely you are to vote, the more impressions you need to these voters because they pay the least amount of attention. And even some stuff I've done when, again, I was running campaigns or at committees, like we had to really like hammer these people with messaging.
Right. So when it comes to voting and the method of voting, we have now moved into election month. It's no longer election day. Every Saturday could be a big early vote turnout weekend. Every kitchen table turns into a polling booth with absentee ballots. What do we learn about method of voting? Why people prefer that? Can campaigns shift that?
So it's growing in both Virginia and New Jersey. We saw a larger share of the electorate cast their ballot before election day than they did in 2021, which was right after COVID. Some people still, may not have gotten their vaccines or might have been a little worried. So even growing from a kind of COVID-ish environment and larger than 2022. Anybody running a campaign in 2026 needs to expect that a greater share of the vote will be cast before election day than it was in even
And
2022.
it gets close to like half of your votes getting cast before election day,
And
depending on
again,
the
it
state.
depends on the states and
Yeah.
the rules and all these things. Like places like Nevada and Arizona, something like election day may be like 20% of the vote, for example, because whether it's vote by mail, the permanent absentee list, or early in person, like people have done it, and basically it's um, what we find is voting is habitual, but also your method of voting is habitual. So all of a sudden, once people learned they could vote, early in person, whether it was from COVID or state rules changes or people got their ballots mailed to them, they're pretty comfortable with that. Um, and so now we're kind of diving in our surveys of what are the reasons people choose their methods, regardless of whether it's early in person, absentee mail, an absentee drop box, or election day. And the biggest thing that shows up in the open ends and the word clouds is everybody says their method is convenient.
Right.
And it's convenient for them. What campaigns need to think about is okay, if I want to try to drive um, more early voting, in some cases, it's going to be really hard to shift somebody, especially if they're a 4-4 voter who always votes on election day, to vote early in person, much like even vote by mail. Again, unless state rules change, etc. Because what we find is the election day voters say it's more convenient for them to drive 5 to 10 minutes to their normal polling place than maybe to drive 20 to 30 minutes to an early in person
And they get to see their
one.
friends, their neighbors, heckle the local Democratic volunteers, that kind of thing.
Yeah, it's a tradition.
Yeah.
They go with their friends and family, all of these things. So if you do want to shift them, it's like okay, how do you make early voting a new tradition? Go with your friends and family, vote early. Um, and again, maybe I think campaigns are learning, like, it may be less about shifting uh, the people who vote into
Hmm.
early voting, but how do you take people who don't vote or maybe occasionally miss an election? Your twos of fours or your threes of fours, and be like, hey, you missed an election. What can we do to kind of ensure that you vote? And maybe early voting is the way to do it, or absentee mail or drop box is like,
Yeah.
hey, here's how you can, you know,
It's
um,
convenient. It's easy. Yeah.
exactly. Oh, because especially when you think about those twos of fours, threes of fours, often those are people who generally vote, but something happened. They had an emergency. They were out of town. Family member got sick. They got sick. So now early voting can kind of take those people and turn them from, twos of fours and threes of fours into fours of fours, because, okay, now we're locking you in, as opposed to the people who are always voting. Like, we don't really need to shift their method of voting.
And I think the other big takeaway that comes from this survey and also our other field tests in New Jersey is that motivating infrequent voters to go vote is not an ideological exercise. It's not, there's not a policy that's just saying, oh, well, I wasn't going to vote. Now I'm going to vote because I know this guy is for this thing. It's no, hey, this is convenient. You've done it before. You know, keep it up. We found that using that kind of streak behavioral language was pretty effective at it. But it's not like, if someone's already going to be motivated by ideology, they're already going to vote, and because
Exactly.
that's what
Yeah.
they do.
In fact, I think that was a big lesson Democrats learned in 2024 when they were trying to motivate younger
Mm.
voters, minority voters, trying to do this message of motivating them as kind of that part of the group. And what they found was the younger voters and minority voters who don't vote have very different views than, younger voters and minority voters who do vote. So I think Republicans can learn from that of, if you're a low propensity Republican who doesn't vote, motivating you on taxes, guns, abortion, whatever that issue is, isn't necessarily going to do it for you, because if that issue motivated you, you wouldn't be low propensity to begin with.
Mhm. So as we wrap up, I think I want to look forward to what this means for campaigns. And for me, the biggest takeaway is I've had to update my mental model of what a voter is, who a voter is, and what does a campaign need to do. And it really does go back to, we used to have this idea of like, oh well, that person doesn't pay attention, they're not a voter. What we're seeing in this data is that there are voters who are disengaged. They still show up and vote. Something triggers them to do that. So this idea of oh well, we're looking at only two of fours and three of fours are going to show up at a midterm, and it's like, well, we don't know. And so my question for you is, what's the thing that winning campaigns in 2026 are going to figure out that others don't?
And I'd say it's not just only twos or fours or higher show up in midterms. There's even in primaries. If you're in a primary somewhere, depending on the state and the rules, somewhere between 1 in 6 and 1 in 4 voters are going to be first time primary voters. And some of that is, voting behavior is a little bit habitual. But when we really think, so all of a sudden you start voting in generals, then you vote in primaries. But when you think about, okay, now you want to turn out these disengaged voters in a midterm, and it's really about reaching them in creative ways. Um, I think it's less about going viral in ways that kind of appeal to your highly engaged partisans, but more what breaks through to people who don't pay attention and reaches them in ways that are relevant to them. So, a couple examples I'd give: think about Donald Trump going to SneakerCon. He was talking to people who probably don't care about politics, but care about sneakers. Or same thing with UFC fights or whatever it is. Um, and when everybody talked about the 2024 cycle as the podcast election, it wasn't, the kind of people who listen to these podcasts or listen to Pod Save America, the Bulwark, whatever kind of political podcast it was. It was about cultural podcasts that reach voters like who, aren't necessarily following politics, whether it's Caller Daddy or Joe Rogan. Um, and so that's really going to be it. How can you reach people in creative ways in the mediums that matter to them? And um, I think about it. Uh, I'll give you a bad example. One that I think it just didn't fit the candidate, but I think it was the right strategy, which was Tim Walz playing
Yeah.
Madden on Twitch. Now, the reason it didn't work was, Tim Walz butchered some, basic football lingo that, he should have kind of known as a former football coach. But I would say, okay, how do you take that strategy and adapt it, depending on who you are? So, if you don't know, if you're not a football coach, you probably shouldn't do that. But imagine if you're like a Dan Crenshaw type, Navy SEAL, and maybe you like playing video games. Maybe you like playing Call of Duty. Why not do a Twitch stream where you play Call of Duty and talk about, how how this game is different than your own missions? Now all of a sudden you're reaching these voters who may not follow politics, but they love gaming, are interested in the military. Now you're connecting with them outside of, politics. Maybe you can talk about issues around, the VA or, other policies that reach them, but you're kind of meeting them where they are, um, uh, and kind of showing that you care about the things that they care about.
And that, I mean, just to sum that up, that is figuring out how to escape containment from your bubble
Yeah.
of the internet,
Yeah.
right? And I think there's a lot of ways into that for Republicans. I think back to Grover Norquist's advice about bringing out the Leave Us Alone coalition, of that works really well. And so how do you go find them? Because they want to be left alone. They don't want to think about politics, but there are issues where politics comes after them. So I want to thank David Kanevsky for a great conversation today. The link to our survey and slides will be in the show notes. You can go check that out on the Center for Campaign Innovation website. If this episode made you a little bit smarter or gave you something to think about, all that we ask is that you share it with a friend or colleague. That's how more people learn about the show. You look smart for recommending a cool podcast. And it's a win-win all around. Remember to subscribe to the Campaign Trend podcast wherever you get your podcasts, so you'll never miss an episode. And be sure and check out our newsletters over at campaigntrend.com. With that, I'll say thanks for listening. See you next time.